What's up? The 2024 ACC football season had its fair share of surprises. Some teams were good, and others flat out stunk. Let's hand out some grades tonight. Welcome to the Nitro College Football Show, college football from a Georgia point of view. I'm Burl.
And I'm Streit.
And today we are talking ACC conference grades. And we just want to say, welcome back, Streit.
I'm back and happy to be here.
You're sorely missed.
Well, thank you.
It's lonely doing a solo pod.
It certainly can be.
Yep. Okay. So most consider the ACC a weak conference, yet they did have 3 playoff teams. There were also some big changes. So tell us about it, Streit.
Yeah. Just like every other conference across the country this year, the ACC was in expansion mode in 2024. And the ACC, the Atlantic Coast Conference, added schools from Texas and from California. That really screams Atlantic, doesn't it, Burl?
Absolutely.
So we had Stanford and Cal joining from the Pac-12, and SMU joined from the American Athletic Conference.
Yeah, you got the Pacific Atlantic, and I don't know what you would call Texas Atlantic.
Yeah. You did have some new coaches in the conference this year. Fran Brown took over at Syracuse. Former Georgia coach went up there and did a great job. Manny Diaz, who had previously been at Miami, took over at Duke, and Bill O'Brien took over at Boston College. Former Penn State coach, former Alabama offensive coordinator, former Patriots assistant Bill O'Brien is
Houston
back.
Texans head coach. I remember him on Hard Knocks when he was saying how much he loved Rick Ross.
So he took over at Boston College this year. As for awards in the conference this year, the ACC Player of the Year as well as the Offensive Player of the Year went to Miami quarterback Cam Ward. Heisman finalist, great player. We will talk more about him certainly. The Defensive Player of the Year was Donovan Ezaraku from Boston College. When we get to Boston College, I'm going to talk a little bit about him because he was absolutely awesome for a Boston College team that didn't really get a lot of national media attention. Coach of the Year was Rhett Lashley. And then they had 2 Freshmen of the Year in the ACC this year, Isaac Brown, the running back from Louisville, and Eli Holstein, the quarterback from Pittsburgh. The season...
How do you have 2 Freshmen of the Year?
I don't know if they tied in the voting, but when I looked it up, they had 2 Freshmen of the Year, so I put them both on this list.
It makes about as much sense as the Atlantic Coast Conference having Pacific teams.
Yep. Clemson snuck into the conference championship game and then defeated upstart SMU 34-31. Another conference championship for Dabo Swinney. It just keeps coming. Even though Clemson's not as good as they've been, their conference hasn't gotten that much better, and so Clemson still finds a way to win. And at the end of the year, obviously, Clemson made the playoff as a conference champion. SMU, controversially, also earned a playoff bid, getting in over Alabama. And then we're going to talk another ACC-adjacent team tonight, and that's Notre Dame, who obviously also made the playoff and went very far.
Yep. All right. Before we start handing out grades, we just want to thank you so much for spending your time with us. Hit that like button on this video. It really helps us out, gets the show going. And tell your friends, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. It also helps us out.
Yeah, and a couple weeks ago, we mentioned that we were going to be doing a giveaway once we got to 100 subscribers. Well, last check, we have 104 subscribers. So if you are interested in winning a set of Georgia autographed football cards, here's what you need to do. You need to leave a comment on this video. And at next week, we will look at all the comments, and everybody who's left a comment and answers this question will be entered in the contest. So my question to you is, who do you think will be the most improved team in college football in 2025? Answer that question. We'll look at the comments, and we will pick out some winners, and we will get in contact with you after that. But other than that, if you also are listening to the show in the audio realm, please be sure to leave us a review and leave us a like. In places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, that really helps us grow the show in the audio realm as well.
Okay, so quick refresher on how we do our grades here. We'll each give our own personal grade, just how we feel that that team did, but then we kind of normalize it with a grade based off their record and how they actually finished. Then we average all of that out and get the final grade. So let's dive in. So we're starting with Notre Dame, and we're including them because they play an ACC conference schedule. They made the Natty, had a chance at the end, so they had a lot to be proud of. What else happened in their season?
Yeah, Notre Dame, breakout season for Marcus Freeman in his third year up there at Notre Dame. His third season after taking over for Brian Kelly, who famously said he couldn't win a national championship at Notre Dame. 3 years later, Notre Dame played for a national championship. They improved their record this year. They still didn't win it, but they at least looked competent against Ohio State, who at the end of the year we know was the best team in the country. They didn't go out there and make a fool of themselves and lose 65-7 or something like that. Notre Dame has continued to improve under Freeman. This year they finished up at 14-2 after going 10-3 last year, and they finished number 2 in the country after losing in the national championship game. The year started off really good for them. They had to play Texas A&M, and they got a big win on national television against an SEC school that many thought would compete for the SEC. And everyone's like, okay, maybe Notre Dame's for real. And then the next week happened.
And then week 2.
Bro, tell us a little bit about week 2.
Man, they had just a juggernaut of a team coming in to their stadium ready to blow the doors off of the Fighting Irish. And that team was NIU, Northern Illinois.
I don't know much about Northern Illinois. I mean, I know they exist and they play football. They once had a guy, I think his last name was Lynch, that was pretty good at quarterback. But
I remember, Michael Turner was from there.
Yeah, I think Michael Turner was there from there as well. Yeah, but Notre Dame lost at home to Northern Illinois, second week of the season.
Yeah, and after that, I mean, a lot of folks, myself included, thought that, man, Notre Dame is done. I mean, how do you come back from that?
Yeah, the good news for them is this season their schedule ended up not being that tough. Notre Dame, they play a part ACC schedule and then they play, an independent schedule. And some years their scheduling works out great for them. Some years those teams that they play are down a little bit and they have an easier time. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, they'll have years where they play in Michigan and Florida State and Clemson and stuff like that. And it's a little bit tougher. But this year their schedule ended up being pretty favorable and it helped them kind of right the ship the rest of the way. Obviously, they went the rest of the way undefeated, really led by that three-headed rushing attack on offense, of Love, Price, and Riley Leonard, but also their defense. Their defense was incredibly strong this season. The number 4 scoring defense and number 11 total defense in the country, and that was after those numbers were adjusted for the playoffs when they played, 4 of the top teams in the country. So they were absolutely what a lot of people criticize Notre Dame as not being in recent years. Tough defensively, good athletes, grit. They certainly showed it because in the past, Notre Dame's Notre Dame. They're good. They've got some good players, but they just can't compete with the schools from the big conferences. Yeah, I think this year they showed up a little bit that they could.
Absolutely. I mean, they were a really tough team, just like you're saying. And when you watched them, you knew that they were going to be in the game and have a chance no matter what, just because they were a, never say die team. Once they got past Northern Illinois, it just clicked. They finally figured out their identity and who they needed to be. And they're kind of built like your old school SEC football team, great interior line play, hard-nosed run game, and a really great opportunistic defense that could get after the quarterback.
Yeah. And I think that opportunistic nature of the team as a whole really helped them in the playoffs, because if you look at their playoff run that they went on, game 1, they were playing Indiana, the battle for the state of Indiana. Really, the early game was fueled by that 90-plus yard touchdown love by Jeremiah Love. that kind of set the stage for the game. And they didn't end up blowing Indiana out, but the game was a blowout without it being a true blowout on the scoreboard. Next game against Georgia, they took advantage right there at the end of the half. They got that fumble where they scored a touchdown, their first touchdown of the game, and then they returned that opening kickoff in the second half. And all of a sudden, a game that was super close went to a lead that Georgia, without a quarterback, just couldn't pass, couldn't get back into the game. And then when they were playing Penn State the next week, the game was tied. Penn State had the ball, and it looked like maybe we were heading for overtime. And Drew Aller, who was a solid quarterback all year for Penn State, throws a bad pick that sets them up for the game-winning field goal. So they were really, really lucky. Luck of the Irish, but they did get some things to go their way in the playoffs that helped them, play solid defense, keep themselves in it, and get them to a national championship game. It was a really, really special season for Notre Dame. First time back in the national championship since 2012.
Yeah, and you got to have some luck on your side to win a championship. I mean, we saw it with Georgia when back-to-back there were several plays that could have changed the outcome of games that happened to go Georgia's way. So, their level of play, putting themselves in the right position so that they could have those things go their way. That's
Absolutely
exactly what they did. And
yeah, you don't luck into playing for a national championship.
Yeah.
But sometimes you got to get a little luck on the way to help you out.
Sometimes you just need that ball to bounce your way.
At the end of the day, this was a great season for Notre Dame. The loss to Northern Illinois still is puzzling, but for me, I can't give them anything less than an A for this season. I thought they were absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, me too. I mean, wins over Georgia, Penn State there at the end, and put up a good fight against Ohio State and then in the national championship. I got to give them an A too. They were rock solid this year. Okay, and so they're based off our records grade. Since they made the Natty, they get an A for that. So for their Notre Dame's 2024 season grade, they get a final grade of an A. All right, so speaking of rough, let's talk about the Clemson Tigers. They had kind of a weird season. Give us a lowdown.
Clemson Tigers in their 16th season under Dabo Swinney, which blows my mind because I remember when Dabo Swinney got the job, he was the interim coach at Clemson, right? And there were rumors that Clemson really wanted to hire Tommy Tuberville from Auburn, but he hadn't been fired yet. And so Clemson named Dabo Swinney the coach, and then Tuberville got fired like a week later. And he ended up being the coach. But yeah, just another weird year in Clemson. They are not the Clemson that they were 5 years ago. They are not the dominating recruiting trail, killing everybody team, but they are still good enough to win the ACC. They went 9-4 last year. They improved their record to 10-4 this year. And of course, won the conference championship, finished number 14 in the AP poll, number 11 in the coaches poll, which honestly seems a little high. The season got off to a really bad start for Clemson. They played Georgia here in Atlanta. Georgia just dog walked them, man. 34-3. Clemson had no answer on offense. And right immediately, people were questioning, what is Dabo doing? Dabo famously didn't take anybody in the transfer portal. Dabo's got to be on the hot seat. This is not, he's got to change his ways and everything. And everybody was really, really on their case that Clemson was done, that they just were not going to have a chance in the ACC.
Yeah, it really looked like they were going to be just some middle of the road team after that Georgia game.
Yeah. And it was weird because what happened right after that Georgia game? They went incredibly hot on offense. Now, throughout the last few years of Clemson's success, while they've had some amazing offensive players, obviously at the quarterback position and the running back and receiver position, they've always been known for their defense, one of the top teams in the country. But their offense went nuts over those next 6 games after that Georgia game, they were scoring 50, 60 points a week. And Cade Klubnik was dicing people up like what was expected of him when he, kind of took over as a freshman starting quarterback. They were on this kind of hot streak. And then they played Louisville, and they lost to Louisville in kind of an upset.
Yeah, they also had a weird close game against Florida State. That didn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, nobody should have been having close games against Florida State this year. After that Louisville game, injuries started creeping up for them, and another criticism of not taking players in the transfer portal. They didn't have the depth that they've had because, like the rest of the country, they've had people leave through the transfer portal. I don't think they've been hit as hard as other schools because Dabo's kind of preached keeping his guys around. But I know late in the season, they barely had enough running backs to play. Phil Maffa, who's a great running back, was playing through pain. There was times I think in their either in their championship game or in the playoff game, they were subbing in like receivers playing running back. Like they were totally decimated at the running back position.
Yeah, and that defense just wasn't what Clemson is used to being. It just wasn't. If they had a more stout defense, then they probably would have won the ACC in a more dominating fashion, and probably wouldn't have that kind of downturn at the end of the season. But they couldn't stop anybody.
Yeah, and if they could have beaten South Carolina in that game, because South Carolina came in so hot, and Clemson was right there with them, and they had a chance. Clemson had a chance to win the game there at the end, and then they threw an interception on their own side and lost to South Carolina. And at that point, everybody thought they were kind of out of it, because it looked like for sure Miami was going to coast into the championship game, and then they lost to Syracuse. And then, Clemson showed up against SMU. It ended up being real close at the end, crazy kickoff stuff. But they showed up and played really well against an SMU team that was 11-1 coming into that game. And they made it into the playoffs, but you kind of knew that they weren't going to have a shot when they had to face Texas in that first round of the playoffs. And quite frankly, they just looked way overmatched.
Oh, yeah. That was a blowout before the game even started.
Yeah.
Although Texas did try to let them back in.
But, at the end of the season, defensively, Clemson was not the same that they've been. They did have a really, really good freshman linebacker, Sammy Brown, who is going to be a star, in college football. He's from the state of Georgia. Georgia recruited him hard, and he didn't end up coming to Georgia. He had a really good year as a freshman. And on offense, they've got to be excited because Klubnik decided to come back. He played fantastic this year and finally lived up to those expectations he had when he kind of pushed DJU out the door and took over. But their recruiting has not been the same when they were, consistently a top 10 recruiting team. I think they've fallen down into the teens, and Sweeney's going to have to open it up a little bit. I think they took a couple of transfers this year, their first ever ones, but I don't think they were people of super significance. So if they're going to hang and continue to be a program that they once were, they're going to have to fix their recruiting, or they're going to have to open it up a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. But somehow they made it into the ACC championship game and won it. And they were one of those teams where this was their only path for making the playoff. So they benefited a lot from the format change.
Absolutely. They were the ACC champion, and they did not have a first round bye in the playoffs. So that tells you all you need to know.
Yep. All right. So what's your grade?
For Clemson, it's continued this down, trajectory that they've had the last few years. They did manage to win their conference, so I can't say it was too horrible, but they've done that a lot lately. So the expectations are still high there. So I gave them a B-.
Yeah, I did too. So right now we're 2 for 2, agreeing with each other. But yeah, same reasons. I mean, if you win your conference and make the playoff, that's a good season by anybody's measure. So I ended up with giving them a B minus. And since they did win their conference and make the playoff, their record grade was an A minus.
So overall in 2024, the Nitro Show grade for the Clemson Tigers is a B.
Good deal. So let's talk about who they faced in the ACC championship. The SMU Mustangs. Is it the 1980s again?
I think they think it is because they're back paying players, though it's legal this time, and they're back winning football games in Dallas. The SMU Mustangs, first year in the conference, they were in the unique position of having been a conference champion last year and moving to a new conference this year. And I think I read that they are the first ever defending conference champion who made it back to a conference championship game in their new conference the next year when they moved. Now, of course, conference moving and stuff has become a lot more common in recent years, and we've really only had conference championship games since the 90s, but so it doesn't strain the whole history of football, but still kind of impressive. They went 11-3 last year, and they went 11-3 again this year. Another good year. They finished up number 12 in the AP, 11th in the coaches poll. But another great season for Coach Rhett Lashley. He's had nothing but success since he's been there. They won a conference last year. They made the playoff this year, losing in the conference championship, but making the playoff this year. So they were projected to finish 7th in the conference coming into the season. So it wasn't like people expected them to be horrible their first year in the ACC, but they really were set up nicely because their schedule was so weak.
Well, that, and they have a rising star, maybe, in Kevin Jennings.
Yeah, who was not the starting quarterback at the beginning of the year. He played really, really well. And they had some star players, at the running back position. They had Brashard Smith, who had 1,200 yards and 14 touchdowns, and linebacker Kobe Wilson, who had 110 tackles. So they had some star players, on the team. And it was really, really kind of fun to watch them introduce themselves, because most of the country, what we know about SMU, we know from Pony Excess, that 30 for 30 that came out, a few years ago, and the death penalty. And that's it. That's all people talk about SMU. They were a once proud, program that has a history. And for 30 years, they didn't do much. And it is kind of fun to see them kind of coming back onto the national stage.
Yep, SMU returning from the dead.
Yep, that's for sure. But at the end of the day, like I said, they did have a really weak schedule, and they did lose all of their games to everybody they played that was ranked. They lost to BYU, they lost to Clemson, and they lost to Penn State. So awesome to make the ACC championship, but, after the season and after they kind of got beat up in the playoff, lots of people were like, oh, did they really deserve that spot more than Alabama? They're kind of a catalyst for a lot of that discussion about playoffs and automatic bids and all that jazz. So for SMU, this was an awesome season. Don't get me wrong. They did a great job coming into a new conference. And you can only play the schedule that you have, much like when we talked about Indiana. But to say that they're ready to be a true player, they're not there yet, but this is Texas, and they have oil money. So be on the lookout for them on the rise in the next few years.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the success SMU had this year, just seeing them come back from the death penalty, and, made lots of jokes throughout the year about, the fighting Craig Jameses. So who knows, maybe they get another Eric Dickerson level running back recruit at some point. We'll see. But because like you said, they got money there. We all know that. We've seen it.
They just haven't
in the past.
They haven't spent it on football in a while because they couldn't. But now that they can again, it wouldn't surprise me, like I said, if they continue to build, especially being in the ACC now. They're the only team in the ACC from the state of Texas. So they've got a whole market there.
Well, just touching back on, their schedule. Yes, they did have a fairly weak schedule, but when you have a chance to beat ranked teams, you need to beat them. And the teams that they lost to were very beatable. BYU, they got beat a lot, or, a decent amount, but they were ranked at the time. And so given that, and, mix in the success, I thought it was a good season for them. I was rooting for them. So I gave them a B+.
Yeah, I was very much impressed. I was a little critical on their schedule, but like I said, you can only play the schedule you have. I gave them an A-. As a defending conference champion and moving into a new conference and still making the playoff, I thought it was an awesome year for them. So I don't think their expectations were that they were going to come in and immediately compete for even the conference championship. So to me, they probably exceeded that. So like I said, I gave them an A-.
Yeah, for me, if they would have won the conference championship, I probably would have been in the A level.
Yep.
But alas, they get a B+ from your boy Burl. So their record grade, since they made the playoff, that gives them a B+ for that. And so the 2024 grade for SMU by the Nitro Show is going to be a B+.
A B+ for the Pony Express.
Yeehaw. Now we're getting into a team that really stood out throughout the year, really made a splash early on, and went out and got one of the best quarterbacks that was available in the portal last year, and backed up the Brinks truck for Cam Ward. We're talking about the Miami Hurricanes here. Great season. Cam Ward, one of the best players in the country, Heisman finalist. He deserved every bit of credit that he got. He was that team.
Absolutely. Miami was a 7-6 football team last year. They went 10-3 this year, and if Cam Ward isn't their quarterback, they probably would have been 7-6 again.
Or worse.
Or worse. Mario Cristobal, in his third season there at Miami, definitely relied on Cam Ward to make that team go. And unfortunately, they hit some bumps in the road that prevented them from being a conference champion and potentially a playoff team. They opened the year up with a great win over Florida, who at the time wasn't seen as much, but by the end of the year was playing great football, and they absolutely dominated Florida. Miami was definitely the strongest team in the state of Florida this year. We'll get to Florida State later.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And the first part of the season, they were just an absolute offensive juggernaut. They scored 38 points or more in their first 9 games. At that point, they were number 5 in the country, and they were 9-0. Now, they had some close calls in there. It wasn't like, yes, they were scoring a lot, but it wasn't like their defense was always great. They had a game at Virginia Tech where Virginia Tech threw a Hail Mary that was completed that got waved off on the last play of the game. And then they went out and played Cal, and they were down 25 points, and they had to rally to beat Cal. So there were some signs there that, hey, yeah, they can score, but the defense may not be quite what they expect to match.
Or even good enough.
Right. And then at that point, everything fell apart when they lost to Georgia Tech.
Yeah, that was kind of that was a big shocker that weekend. I remember watching that game, and I was actually pulling for Tech. I'll say it, as a Georgia fan. It was kind of fun to see just huge underdogs there, and Tech played a great game, really hard-nosed game, and pulled it out. It was a big shock.
And Miami deserved to lose that game because you knew exactly what Georgia Tech was doing in that game. That was the game that Haynes King was hurt. And so they were rotating quarterbacks the whole game. They'd put Haynes King in to run the ball because he couldn't throw it, and they'd put in Philo in whenever they wanted to throw it. And so they were telegraphing what they were doing, and Miami still couldn't stop them. And they finally got close at the end, and I think they threw an interception or whatever it was, but the cracks that had been there all season finally showed, and they couldn't overcome it. Now, they were playing in the ACC, and so they still had a shot to make the playoffs. After that was all said and done, they were staring the playoffs in the face. They would have almost guaranteed themselves a spot in the playoffs, and they would have been in the conference title game instead of Clemson. And then they lost to Syracuse to close the season.
Yeah, I have a bone to pick with Miami. The whole season, I kept saying, yeah, this is the team I trust the least. And then the week before they lose, I had said, okay, I get it. Just watching Cam Ward, I'm in. They're real. And then they go and lose to Georgia Tech. So I was frustrated with Miami at that point. So I was happy when they lost to Syracuse. I thought that was a fantastic way to end the season. And I was so happy for Syracuse and Fran Brown.
And that wasn't the end of the season for Miami, though, because when they did play in the bowl game, they played in the Pop-Tarts Bowl, the greatest bowl game there is.
Yes.
And then they were part of another weird situation. Cam Ward had opted in to play in the Pop-Tarts Bowl, made a big deal, and they were playing great. They were leading at halftime, and they came out the second half, and he was out of the game. He had pulled himself out of the game. And there was lots of controversy about it. I don't know if it was a plan or what it was, but the media blew it up. But as soon as he came out of the game, they sucked, and they ended up losing the game, and it kind of left a sour note on the end of their season.
Yeah, I think he played just to break Case Keenum's all-time yardage record for passing, which got broken a week later by Dylan Gabriel.
So like I said, Cam Ward was awesome. He was obviously in New York as a Heisman finalist. And this was a good team. They finished up number 18 in the country. But when you look at the potential of what they had going into that Syracuse game, all they had to do was win that game and they would have been in the playoff, because they would have played in the conference championship game at 11-1. And even if they would have lost to another 11-1 SMU, they would have made the playoff. SMU made the playoff after losing to Clemson. So certainly they would have been in. So, all this hope and everything, it's just kind of frustrating, because how many years has Miami now been in the ACC? What is it? Almost 20 years now. They've never won the conference.
That's incredible.
After almost 20 years. So just another missed opportunity, I really think, for them. For that reason, like I said, they were a great team. They got up to number 5 in the country. They had a Heisman finalist. They certainly improved their record from the year before. So I gave them a B.
That's fair. I actually gave them a B-. And the reason being is they had very disappointing losses, and that defense was really, really bad when they needed them most. When they played decent teams, you saw how bad it was. And like you said, if they beat Syracuse, they're probably in the playoff. So he should have been there. So B- from Burl. As far as their record goes, since they could have made, I'm considering the fact that I think they could have made the playoff, like they were a bubble team.
They were 10-2, so they were definitely in consideration.
Yeah.
So
like we said, if they win that game, they're in probably.
Yeah.
So they get a B for that reason.
And so the final score for the Miami Hurricanes from the Nitro Show in 2024 is a B-.
All right. So speaking of the team that derailed Miami's season and kept them out of the playoffs, let's talk about the Syracuse Orange.
They'll always be the Syracuse Orangemen to me. It's just weird to call them the Syracuse Orange when your mascot's an orange. But you're not the Syracuse Oranges. Syracuse, first-year head coach Fran Brown, came from Georgia. And honestly, this was a really, really good year for Syracuse. They were 6-7 last year and brought in Fran Brown. They went 10-3 this year. Obviously, they had, some upset wins throughout the year. They finished number 20 in the AP poll and number 22 in the coaches poll. And the star of Syracuse team was a cast-off. Kyle McCord
He had
came
a
to
great year.
Syracuse because he got ran out of town at Ohio State. And I never understood it. And honestly, Ohio State would have still won the national championship if he stayed there. But Kyle McCord went and had an amazing year at Syracuse. Like, I was looking up the stats. I knew he had a great year because I knew he finished 10th place in the Heisman voting. Guy threw for 4,800 yards and 34 touchdowns.
Yeah, that's pretty good. New high score,
Like,
is that good?
Yeah. I was amazed when I saw that he, threw for that many yards. But then I took another look at the team, reviewing their season. They had a lot of lack of running game, particularly in those losses. And those 3 losses were not good. When they played Stanford, they only had 26 yards rushing. When they played Pittsburgh, they only had 6 yards rushing and had 5 turnovers. And when they lost to Boston College, they only had 39 yards rushing. So, yes, Kyle McCord was awesome and they were throwing the ball over the place. But in those 3 losses, which were all to teams that they should have beaten, they couldn't run the ball. And that's probably the reason they lost those games.
Yep. If you can't run the ball, you're going to have a hard time closing out games. And you're going to have, we saw this at Georgia because Georgia's running game wasn't there mainly because of the O-line. But when your quarterback's throwing 40, 50 times a game, and in this case, just racking up yards, it's going to be hard to close out those games. I thought this was one of the best turnarounds we've seen in college football in a long time, because you never think of Syracuse as even anything right now.
You haven't thought of them much as a relevant team on the national landscape since Donovan McNabb was there.
Exactly.
And they really were a solid football team. And Fran Brown, when he first came to Georgia, it was a big deal. He was an assistant coach at Rutgers before he came to Georgia. And people are like, well, why is Kirby going to get this guy from Rutgers? And everybody's like, no, this guy's a dude. And he went up there. He took a couple of guys from Georgia with him. Jackson Meeks. We could have used Jackson Meeks this year. He's going to be drafted this year. We really could have used him. They had a trio of receivers with 70 catches and over 900 yards. Like, that's awesome. That's really spreading the ball around. And like I said, the only flip side was that the running game was non-existent. LaQuint Allen had 1,000 yards, and that was it. And I literally mean it. They only had one player who even had 100 yards on the ground for the season outside of that guy. So the running game was non-existent. And that might be why you saw 4,800 yards, out of Kyle McCord.
Well, I mean, still, you have a running back with 1,000 yards. That's still impressive.
Yeah, but like I said, they had no other running backs with like any yards. 1,000 yards on a season for a whole team, that ain't much.
Fair enough. But yeah, I thought it was a great season for Syracuse. And because of that turnaround and the big win against Miami there at the end, and, given the shout out from Fran Brown to Kirby Smart, I ended up giving a B+.
Yeah, I actually gave them an A-. They got the 10 wins because they put up a 50 spot on Washington State in their bowl game. So their last 2 games of the season, they beat Miami and knocked them out of the playoffs. And then they beat a Washington State team who, didn't really have a conference this year, but was scoring well. And they put up 50 on them. That's how you close out a strong season, especially for a first-year head coach. So I gave them an A-. I thought it was an excellent season for Syracuse.
Yeah, great season for them. I just can't give anybody an A that doesn't make the playoff. That's just me. My own bias there. All right, so they're great for their record since they had a winning season and were bowl eligible. That gets them a B- for that. And the Nitro Show final grade for the Syracuse Orange 2024 football season is a B.
Up next, we have the Louisville Cardinals. Finished 2024 at 9-4 after going 10-4 last year under Jeff Brom in his second season. At 9-4, they did not finish ranked this year, but they had a couple of really good highlights this season, particularly the huge upset win over Clemson, who, like we mentioned before, Clemson came into that game on a hot streak, scoring like crazy, and Louisville just beat them, knocked them out. And on the back of that, they were rising up in the rankings, and eventually they reached as high as 15 this year, before they lost to Notre Dame.
Yeah, they seemed like they were on the cusp of really breaking through to be a contender. They were always that team, like, watch out for Louisville, watch out for Louisville. They're going to sneak up on you.
Yeah. And then, they had a, sixth or seventh year starting quarterback and Tyler Shaw, who was really, really good. They had an awesome freshman running back, Isaac Brown, and a star wide receiver in Ja'Cory Brooks. They were really, really a good offensive football team. And despite the 4 losses on the season, one was bad. They lost to Stanford, but their other 3 losses were to Notre Dame, SMU, and Miami. Those 4 losses on the season were by a combined 24 points.
Yeah, losing, 4 games by 24 points, that's pretty solid. Especially given the teams that they lost to there, one being played in the national championship.
They were good down the stretch. They won 5 of their last 6 games. And it wasn't really quite a feat to beat Kentucky, but this was their first time that they'd beat their in-state rival Kentucky since 2017.
Really?
So, yeah, Kentucky had owned them lately. And so that was a little bit good for them.
This was the year to do it.
Yeah, it was. They beat Kentucky, and then, like I said, then they went out and they won their bowl game. They beat Washington, who, as we all know, was in the national championship game last year. So, closing out on a bright spot, pretty good year. Essentially the same record as the year before. And for all their losses being so close, I gave them a B+.
So generous today. Well, I did not. So since, they did have 4 losses and one of them being to a really bad Stanford team, and just for the sheer fact that they just couldn't get over that hump to take over the ACC, because it was theirs for the taking. Like, they could have ran and gotten it, but they didn't. So I ended up giving them a B. And as far as their grade for their record, they had a winning season and they were bowl eligible. So that gets them a B-.
So in 2024, the Nitro Show final grade for the Louisville Cardinal is a B.
Is that the Louisville Cardinal or the Cardinals?
It's Louisville Cardinals. I screwed that up. Sometimes I do that.
That would be the funniest thing ever if they just nixed the S. It's the Louisville Cardinal versus the Stanford Cardinal.
All right. Just up the road, the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets in 2024. They went 7-6, just like they did in 2023. It was Brent Key's second full season at Georgia Tech. We all remember that he took over late in the season for Geoff Collins a few years ago. They didn't finish ranked again, but I ended up watching a good bit of Georgia Tech this year because they had big games that were on nationally. They played in week 0 against Florida State over there in Ireland. Obviously the Georgia game. I saw a lot of the upset of Miami. So ended up seeing a lot of Georgia Tech this year, and they were really, really an improved team who was really, really tough.
Very tough team. Very tough.
Yeah, and you can finally see that they are getting past the years where they were so talent depleted. They were still feeling the residuals of, the Paul Johnson triple option years and the Jeff Collins 404, the culture years, that really left Georgia Tech with not that many good football players. But this year you kind of have finally seen some players that are like, hey, those guys are good, and Tech's finally getting back to a little bit more of what they used to be, which was a very, very solid ACC football team. The year started out great for them. Like I said, winning that week 0 game on national television against Florida State, who nobody knew what Florida State was going to become at that point, was a good way for them to start the season. It put them on display for the country to see and let people notice, hey, they've got something going here with Haynes King at quarterback.
I would say that this Tech team was easy to root for nationally because they played really tough. And that was epitomized by Haynes King. He was an absolute warrior on the field and took tons of damage throughout the season, just laying it all on the line.
They'd finally gotten into the top 25 early in the year, but they suffered losses to Syracuse and Louisville, and they never recovered to get back into the top 25 after that. But then, of course, we got to the Miami game. Miami came into that game number 4, number 5 in the rankings, and they beat them 28-23. And they really showed some balance at the quarterback position in that game. Haynes King was really banged up and really couldn't throw the ball. And so you saw them switch the quarterbacks between him and Aaron Philo, and they were able to move the ball. Miami, couldn't really answer what they were doing, and it led to arguably one of the biggest upsets of the season. And really put on display their star receiver, Eric Singleton, who ended up being one of the best receivers in the country and ended up being like the top-rated transfer prospect to the transfer portal this season. So good luck at Auburn, Singleton. But at the end of the year, obviously for Georgia Tech, they always put a lot into the Georgia game. That Georgia has really owned that rivalry for a long time. And even though they ended up losing that game in 8 overtimes, I would say that might have been Tech's best game of the season.
Oh, by far. They had that game dominated until 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter.
It wasn't just that they were winning. They whipped Georgia physically, and they outcoached Georgia in that game as well. Haynes King was a god in that game.
Yeah.
Like, there was nothing he could do wrong. He could run the ball. He could pass the ball. He was making everything. And unfortunately, that ended up biting them at the end because when they did get to overtime, he was just out of gas.
Yeah. And I think it's really cool with these coaches that we have at Georgia and Georgia Tech. They both played at their respective schools, and they grew up as fans of those schools. So it means a lot to these guys. I mean, you saw in the press conference after the game,
Brent Key was wiped, man.
Yeah, Brent Key was he was distraught. Like, you could tell that he couldn't believe what just happened. The Tech should have won that game. They absolutely should have won that game.
They really should have. They outplayed Georgia, and it was one Dan Jackson hit and freezing cold weather that helped Georgia get the win in the end. But
that was the most stressful game I've ever watched as a Georgia fan.
Absolutely. And the season after that, they had a good bowl game against Vanderbilt. It was kind of the battle of the nerds, and Vanderbilt beat them. They both showed up to play, and so that kind of left a little bit of a sour taste on what was a really good year for Tech. I think 8-5 would have sounded really good for Tech this year. Because they were 7-6 last year.
Maybe if they still had Singleton, it's different, but who knows?
Yeah, they did improve their record from the year before, but I really felt like they were a much better team than they have been in years. So for that, I gave Georgia Tech a grade of a B.
Yeah, it was a season of ups and downs. Like you said, they didn't improve their record from the year before. There were probably some other games in there that they should have won, but overall, I think it was a much improved talent-wise team, physical, hard-nosed, gritty, and just because I hate Tech, I'm gonna give them a B minus.
Yeah, here's a funny thing is if they would have hung on to win that Georgia game, they would have had 3 wins over top 10 teams on the season.
Yeah,
because Florida was a top 10 team when they played them. They obviously beat Miami, and then they almost beat Georgia. So
if they beat Georgia, I would have probably given them an A for the season. I'd give them a rare A.
I think most of their fans would have as well.
So their grade for their record being that they had a winning season and they were bowl eligible, they get a B minus for that.
All right. So with that being said, their final grade in 2024 from the Nitro Show, the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets get a B minus.
Yes.
Which is a lot lower than what they usually get on their report cards.
True. Absolutely true. Great school.
Okay. All right. Up next, we have the Duke Blue Devils. Under Coach Manny Diaz in his first season, the Duke Blue Devils went 9-4 this year after being 8-5 last year. And, it was a good year for Duke. They won 9 out of their 10 games against unranked opponents. So, yeah, they won 9 games, but it was kind of a weak schedule. And they went 0-3 against ranked teams. So that 9-4 record, while good, was a little misleading. This year they had Malik Murphy playing quarterback for them, former Texas Longhorn. And you thought coming in that he was going to lead them, but they really struggled running the football. They were 128th out of 134 teams in the country running the football. So that meant that their offense ended up not being that great. Defense was a little better. It was, pretty average. They were 58th in the country in total defense, 60th in scoring. But the one highlight, I guess you could call it a highlight, was that for the first time in Duke school history, they defeated Florida State.
Wow. Well, this was the year.
This was the year. It took the worst Florida State arguably in the school's history, but Duke got the job done, and they beat Florida State.
Along with everybody else. But yeah, I mean, it was a really great season for Duke, and like you said, beat the teams that they were supposed to beat. And you're right, they did have a good season, owning the state of North Carolina, beating that powerhouse, Elon. That's a tough one, if you know. But yeah, overall good season. Looking forward to seeing what they do in the future, because they always seem to have upstart kind of vibe to them. They're a team that you always look out for. It was like they might have the big upset, or they might sneak up on somebody. But yeah, good season. Since they did improve their record, I ended up giving them a B. It was just it was a good season.
Yeah. I think I'm looking more at them. One of the things that really helped them out this year was that they were really good at turnovers. They forced the most fumbles in the entire country. And when you're a team that's not doing that well on offense, getting yourself in situations where you can get quick scores and get the other team off the field is always important. So I think that was really helpful for them.
Yeah, that's always going to help.
Yeah, and Mike Elko had done a really good job there and left to take the job at Texas A&M. Manny Diaz had kind of been a failure at Miami previously, so you didn't really know what to expect from him there, but he did a good job. And obviously, at the end of the year, they were no match for Ole Miss in the Gator Bowl, but hell, that Ole Miss team, when they wanted to play, could probably beat anybody in the country.
Yeah.
This was their third straight 8-win season, and their 8th winning season in their last 12. And you say, oh, that doesn't sound like anything special. Consider this. Before those last 12 years, when they've had 8 winning seasons in their last 12, they had 22 losing seasons in 23 years.
Wow.
So this program that post Steve Spurrier was absolutely one of the bottom feeders in all of college football has turned itself around. It's not a championship program, but it is certainly one that has found the right recipe to win games at a traditionally basketball school that's really known for academics. They've had more success than their comparatives, Vanderbilt, Georgia Tech, Stanford. A lot of those schools haven't been able to really stay consistent as winners, but Duke really has. So they've done a great job there. With all that being said,
they kind of remind me of Kentucky, not this year, but over the past 5 years.
There are the comparisons are obviously there with the basketball school as well. With that being said, I gave them a B+, being it was Manny Diaz's first year, and being that Riley Leonard transferred to Notre Dame, they were replacing their quarterback. Yes, the schedule was easy, and yes, they won the games that were easy on their schedule, but it's a good first year, a good start, and they beat everybody in North Carolina. They beat Florida State for the first time in school history, so I gave them a B+.
Yeah, and for the record, they had a winning season. They were bowl eligible, so that's a B-. So that makes their final grade, the Nitro Show final grade for the Duke Blue Devils 2024 football season is a B. Also not like their report cards.
All right, up next we have the Virginia Tech Hokies. They finished the year 6-7 after going 7-6 last season. In their third year under Brent Pry, Virginia Tech opened the season with an overtime loss to Vanderbilt, and that kind of started a trend of 5 one-score losses throughout the season. Their running game was good, their defense was good, but it just hadn't really gotten much better than last year. Bayshawn Tootin was their lead rusher. He had 1,100 yards, 15 touchdowns. But the real star on this team was Antoine Powell Ryland, who was a transfer from Florida. He recorded the third most sacks in the country with 16, and he was 6th in tackles for loss with 19. So he was the real star for this team. But for them, their issues were close games. They just couldn't get stops in close games, and that's why they ended up losing a lot this year. Their only double-digit loss was to Clemson, so they lost 7 games this year, but 6 of them were single-score games.
Yeah, I mean, this is a program that we've just seen continue to decline each year since Frank Beamer retired, and it's hard to see if they're going to be able to improve in the future. I mean, really, the most interesting thing about Virginia Tech right now is the Enter Sandman intro at the beginning of the season, because after the first few games, it's like, eh.
Yeah. Yeah, they were still doing okay, but the last month of the season really hurt them. They had 3 losses in the last month of the season, and then they lost their bowl game. So really 4 losses at the end of the season. They went from being a 6-3 football team with a chance to have a winning record to 6-7, losing a bowl game. And it led to a lot of coaching changes after the regular season. They fired their defensive coordinator. So for them to get back on track, they're going to have to make some changes, both with their coaches, but also in their personnel. I think it's a disappointing year for them. I think they kind of had hope. They'd had some losing seasons, and they had a winning year last year, and they were expecting to do a little bit better this year. So for me, I gave them a C-.
Yeah, just a really disappointing year, and they were on the cusp of being able to have a good year, but they didn't do it. So I gave them a C- as well. Okay, as far as their record goes, they were bowl eligible. They did not have a winning season, so they get a C+ for that. And for their 2024 Nitro Show final grade, the Virginia Tech Hokies get a C.
And they're not doing the hokey pokey, and they're not turning themselves around.
So now let's drive on up to the Northeast, little Boston College. Do you want to tell us about their season?
Sure. So Boston College got a new head coach this year. Bill O'Brien took over. They were 7-6 last year. They went 7-6 against 7-6 again this year, and going around 500 has kind of become the norm for Boston College. That's kind of what they are, is a 500 football team, and that didn't change this year. They could have had a better season, really, if they could have pulled off an upset of Missouri. They were 14-point underdogs to Missouri, who was coming off a great year last year where they had beaten Ohio State in their bowl game, and I think was a preseason, maybe around 10, 11 in the country. Boston College was a heavy underdog in that game, but they only lost by 6. And so despite that loss, they got off to a really good start. They were 4-1 with only that one loss on their record. And they beat Syracuse, a team that, would go on to be pretty strong in the conference. But they had to play SMU, and SMU was rising at the time. Obviously they became a playoff team, and they ended up losing that game. But overall, it was just a very middle-of-the-road season on both offense and defense for Boston College. They were 67th in the country in scoring offense. They were 53rd in the country on scoring defense. So nothing spectacular to write home about.
They are the definition of average.
Right. Like I said, they kind of finish around 500 pretty much every single season. This season was a little bit different because they won 7 games in the regular season, whereas a lot of times they win 6 games in the regular season and win that 7th one in their bowl game. This was the first time they'd won 7 games in the regular season since 2018. So that was a little bit better than what it had been.
Yeah, I'd say it's a decent first season for Bill O'Brien. He's trying to build his stock back up, and a good first season laying the groundwork. We'll see what happens next year and in the future. But yeah, just a ho-hum middle of the road season. So I just gave him a C.
Yeah, I gave them a C as well, though. I have to point out that there was one player on this team who would not earn a C, and that was defensive end Donovan Ezeraku, one of the best defensive ends in the country this season. He won the Hendricks Award as the best defensive end in the country. As a defensive end, this guy had 80 tackles, and he finished second in the country in sacks with 16.5. He's the conference defensive player of the year, and I don't know how well he did at the Combine this last weekend, but I know at least the discussion has been that this guy's going to be a top 10, top 15 pick. He's one that the NFL is salivating on. I think he's going to be a hell of a player. So, Bill O'Brien, when he was the OC down there at Bama, they had some really, really, really good offensive players, but he had one this year. So, like I said, I gave Boston College a C for the season because it really was, as you said, just an average season. But Donovan Ezeraku was not just average. He was a fantastic player for them this year.
Yeah, he's a dude. He's going to make a lot of money. Yeah. Or I guess a lot more money. Yeah. So for the record, they had a winning season. They were bowl eligible, so that earns them a B-.
So in 2024, the Nitro Show final grade for the Boston College Eagles was a C.
All right. Next, we're going to talk about Pittsburgh, the Pitt Panthers, the mortal enemies of West Virginia. Tell us about how their season went, Streit.
Pittsburgh's an interesting case because just on paper, You look at last year, they were 3-9, really bad. You look at this year and see 7-6. Well, that's an improvement. They must have been a good team. But then you dig into what happened to Pittsburgh this season, and you find out that this 7-6 season may have just been as bad or worse than that 3-9 season was. Pat Narduzzi is 10th year. Pittsburgh, gosh, he's been there a long time. This season started off, and it couldn't be any better. They got off to a 7-0 start, and they were number 18 in the country.
Yeah, I feel like this is a theme in the ACC. I've said this about a couple teams tonight, but after that 7-0 start, they become the team of, oh, look out for them.
Right.
Play them. They might get you, but was not to be for it.
Yeah, I mean, part of that 7-0 start was their play at quarterback. Eli Holstein, who was a freshman who had transferred from Alabama because he wasn't going to get to start at Alabama, which I don't know why, because he probably would have been better than Jalen Milroe, but that's another point. He came in and he was off to a great start. In that 7-0 start, he had 17 touchdown passes and only 5 picks. But then they got into the 8th and the 9th game and the 10th game of the year. He had some interceptions. And then, unfortunately, in the 10th game of the season, he suffered a really, really bad broken leg. And he was out for the season.
Tough break.
And yeah, and without him, they never recovered. They just kind of steamrolled, fell off the side of a cliff on offense in the second half of the season. And they couldn't win a game. They went from 7-0 to 7-6, including losing their bowl game to Toledo. So a season that was so promising, that looked so good, that looked like they were a real team, a real competitor in the conference, and it just died. Despite the fact that they lost their quarterback, they still finished 30th in the country in scoring. So that tells you a little bit about how good they were at the beginning of the year. They had a good running back. Desmond Reed had almost 1,000 yards. They had a leader at linebacker. Kyle Lewis had 16 tackles for a loss and 4 picks from the linebacker position. That's a lot. It's just disappointing. Falling off like that, going from 7-0 to 7-6, it's just not what you expect from a coach who's in their 10th year of the program, right? Like that
Absolutely.
Falling off is something you expect from a coach that hasn't been there long, or, who was on their way out, but not a solid coach who's been there for so long. It's just perplexing.
Is he a solid coach? I don't know. You never know what you're going to get with Pitt from year to year. Some years, you hear like, oh, they're going to be great. They're going to be tough. They're going to have this hard-nosed defense because Narduzzi's a defensive coach, and I don't know. I mean, they're nothing to be scared of at this point. And what a disappointing season after going 7-0. Like you said, that might feel worse than going 3-9.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, like I said, after that 7-0 start, they were becoming the hot team. There's some buzz around them, but then just off a cliff. So I gave them a C- for that.
Yeah, I gave them a C. Strictly on the fact that they did start 7-0 and they got up to number 18 in the country. And yes, they lost a bunch in the second half of the season, but they lost their quarterback. So if there's, any silver lining, it's that maybe they would have not lost all those games if they'd had their quarterback, who was playing really well, who, despite missing the last, 3 games of the year, was named one of the conference freshmen of the year. So I gave him a C.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, maybe future's bright there in that area. So you never know. As far as their record, they had a winning season and they were bowl eligible, where they lost to Toledo. So they get a B- for that. And for the Nitro Show final grade for the Pitt Panthers 2024 football season, they get a C.
All right. Up next, don't turn your back on the Wolfpack. It's the
I was thinking
NC
the
State.
same thing, man.
NC State was disappointing this year, man. They were 9-4 last year, and lots of people had high expectations for the Wolfpack. I think they were preseason number 24. They received 8 first-place votes in the conference preseason poll. They used the transfer portal a bunch in this offseason. They brought in some pretty high-profile guys. Noah Rogers, wide receiver from Ohio State. And the big one was Grayson McCall, the quarterback, who had torn it up the last few years at Coastal Carolina. And you expected to come in and be a star for them and kind of light it up and help lead them.
And it was kind of shocking that he went to NC State in the first place because he was very sought after.
He was. But they got a quick dose of reality right at the beginning of the season, week 2, when they got absolutely destroyed by Tennessee, 51-10.
Oh, yeah. I remember that vividly. That was such a good win for Tennessee. Everybody was giving Nico the Heisman after that.
I think that was that the only game that Tennessee really kind of looked like old Tennessee of recent years?
Yeah. I mean, Nico looked amazing. I mean, he had an awesome game.
Yeah. But unfortunately for NC State, things just went downhill from there. Grayson McCall ended up getting hurt. He suffered a head injury, and ultimately he ended up having to retire from football altogether.
That's sad, man.
Just a shocking turn of events from a guy that was, heck, he probably could have been drafted in the NFL last year.
Yeah.
He was a really good player for Coastal Carolina, and he got hurt, and that ended his career. And they ended up only being 58th in the country in passing, which coming into a season with McCall, that's not what they expected. They didn't have much of a running game. They were 83rd in the country in rushing. So I think they expected to be more of a passing heavy team this year. And with McCall getting hurt, they just weren't that. But the biggest issue that this team had was their rushing defense. It was horrible. They gave up 249 yards rushing against Tennessee. And if you thought that was bad, they gave up 269 yards rushing against Clemson. Now,
Georgia needed to schedule them this year just to have one good game rushing the ball.
I mean, but the thing is, those are two teams that are good rushing teams, but they weren't triple option teams. Putting up 250 and 270 on the ground, that's a lot of yards on the ground. And like I said, they were just back and forth the rest of the way. No real good wins. They won one, lost one, win 2, lost 2, so on, just the whole year through. 103rd ranked defense in the country. They gave up 50 in both of its losses to ranked opponents. And what I found especially surprising is that North Carolina State has not won a conference championship in 45 years.
Wow, they're like the Ole Miss of the ACC.
Yeah. I mean, you think North Carolina State, they're usually a pretty good team. They're a bowl game, and you would think they would have a conference championship somewhere in there, but it's been 45 years. This was a year that was filled with expectations. Lots of writers picked them to win the conference, and unfortunately injuries and a lack of a rushing game and a lack of defense cost them. So for me, this was almost a disastrous season for them. I gave them a D.
Yeah, absolutely disastrous season, especially after going 9-4 the year before. Just mediocre. I mean, that's how I would describe it. So I gave him a D- because I'm mean. But for their record, they were bowl eligible, so they had that going for them, which is nice. They get a C+ for that.
All right. So for their final grade in 2024, the North Carolina Wolfpack from the Nitro Show, we give them a grade of a D.
All right, staying in North Carolina, raise up. Let's talk about some Tar Heels. What's the lowdown on their season?
North Carolina is always one of those teams that you keep hearing if they would ever actually put the effort into their football team that they put into their basketball team, they could be really good. They have a strong alumni base. They have support. People come to their games. But this year was another year that was just met with disappointment. They were 8-5 last year. Mac Brown was back for another season, and they went 6-7 this year. Mac Brown ended up getting fired before the bowl game. Just wasn't good. Like it was a back and forth season. They started out 3-0, and then they lost 4 games in a row, highlighted by the fact that they lost a game in which they gave up 70 points to James Madison.
Is that bad?
Yeah, that's pretty bad. And
you always hear about, North Carolina, they're going to be a sleeping giant. They're going to be a sleeping giant. And it just never happens.
Yeah. During that 4-game losing streak, 3 of those games were at home and they lost them. And I think at that point, the team, the fan base, and even Mac Brown himself really lost confidence in what he was doing. There were reports after that 70-point game to James Madison that Mac Brown was in the locker room and talking to his players and like questioning whether he even had it as a coach anymore. And I think
is wild because he was one of 3 coaches that have actually won a national title on all of college football.
Right. After that 4-game losing streak, they did come back and they won 3 straight ACC games. So they kind of got things back on track a little bit at that point, but they just closed out with, overall with the 6-7 record. The one bright spot they did have was their running back, Omarion Hampton, was fantastic. The guy had 1,600 yards and 15 touchdowns. Like he was absolutely a load.
That's a solid year.
Yeah. But their defense was bad, and their defense has been bad the last few years. And surprise, surprise, who was their defensive coordinator? None other than good old Jeff Collins, Mr. 404 the culture. Yeah, they were not good. 89th in the country, scoring defense, and just bad. They only had 1 win this season with a team that had a winning record, and that was in week 1 over Minnesota. What hurt them this year? They did lose their quarterback. Max Johnson had transferred in, after being at Texas A&M and LSU. He was expected to come in and have a good year, and he got hurt again. He broke his leg. I think it was pretty gross injury when it happened. So he ended up being out for the year. He is coming back next year. That guy's been in college forever, Mark Richt's nephew. But bad year. They finished 6-7, and after finishing 6-6 in the regular season, Mac Brown was fired. And next year, Bill Belichick is the head coach of the North Carolina Tar Heels. And that still might be one of the weirdest sentences I think I've ever uttered in relation to college football.
Oh, yeah. That's going to be something to see. We'll see how that goes. Maybe this is what wakes up the sleeping giant.
Yeah, maybe. That being said, I gave them a grade of a C-. I think it was a pretty bad year for North Carolina. Expectations were certainly better than a 6-7 and firing a coach.
Yeah, I mean, really the best thing I can say about the Tar Heels 2024 season is that they hired Bill Belichick. I mean, seriously.
That could be the best or the worst thing that ever happened to them.
You never know. It certainly is the most interesting. It got a lot of eyes on North Carolina, and I don't know. I mean, he is the greatest head coach in pro football history, so that's kind of good credentials there. But overall, just a terrible season. I gave him a C-. It was just bad. As far as their record goes, they were bowl eligible, even though they didn't have a winning season, so that earns them a C+ for that. The Nitro Show final grade for the North Carolina Tar Heels 2024 football season is a C minus.
And a good luck to Bill Belichick and his 22-year-old girlfriend.
Heyo.
Up next, we have the Virginia Cavaliers. They finished 5-7 in 2024 after finishing 3-9 in 2023. Coach Tony Elliott in his third season for Virginia showed a little bit of improvement from the year before, but not much. This team really got off to a good start.
They got a little bit better than they were the year before. And just getting a little bit better is all you can ask for.
That's very true. They were 4-1 to start the season. Although that one loss was to Maryland, who was god-awful, horrible. But the second half of their season was really bad. Obviously, they went 1-6 down the stretch. Mostly because they were facing a lot more competition. Their schedule was much more difficult in the second half of the season, including facing 4 teams that were ranked when they played. And for Virginia this year, scoring was the issue. They only scored more than 24 points once in those last 8 games, and they ended up 109th in the country in scoring.
You can't win football games if you can't score.
Yeah, and the other bad thing was that their defensive scoring wasn't much better. They were 93rd in the country.
Yeah, you can't win games if you can't stop it.
If you can't score and can't stop anybody, you're not going to win a lot of football games. So maybe it's a miracle that they won 5 games.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, they never really got settled at the quarterback position. Anthony Calandria eventually got benched for Tony Muskett at the end of the season. Guys,
what a great name for a quarterback of the Virginia Cavaliers.
Muskett. He is.
That's great.
The highlight of their season was beating Pittsburgh, who at the time Pittsburgh was 18th in the country, as we mentioned before.
Yeah, they were the hot team to watch out for.
Right, and then Virginia knocked them down. But the end of the season ended up on a sour note. They were 5-6 going into their rivalry game against Virginia Tech. Chance to make a bowl game, and they failed miserably. They lost 37-17, and they were out of bowl contention again. So at the end of the day, their record was an improvement from the year before, but they were just not a good football team. As we mentioned, they didn't score much, and they couldn't stop people from scoring. So when you do that, you end up on the wrong side of a bunch of blowouts, and you end up with a 5-7 record. Somehow they did manage to win 5 games, so I give them a C+.
Yeah, I mean, with Virginia, you don't have high expectations that they're going to go out and be contenders. Every now and then they pop up and have a good season, and it's more of a surprise than anything. But this year was just another bad year, even though they did improve. Like you said, I gave them a C because, I mean, you know.
Yeah.
As far as their record goes, since they won 5 games, they get a C for that. And so the Nitro Show final grade for the Virginia Cavaliers 2024 football season is a C-. Let's go to one of those Pac Atlantic schools.
We'll go out to Berkeley with all the hippies. We got the Cal Golden Bears, who are coached by Justin Wilcox, who's in his 8th season. Seems like a long time for a coach at a school that hasn't really had much football success in recent years. In 2023, they went 6-7, and in 2024, they backed that up by going 5-7. So they didn't make a bowl game, whereas they did the year before. Small step back, could be expected moving into a new conference, but a little disappointing when you've got an 8th-year head coach. The main bright spot for this team really was their quarterback, Fernando Mendoza. He became one of the hottest names on the transfer quarterback market this year. He was a good player for them, and he played a huge factor in their 2 biggest wins of the season. Week 2, they upset Auburn. Why the hell did Auburn travel to play Cal? I don't know, but they paid for it because they lost to Auburn 21-14. And then they also scored a blowout 44-7 victory over former conference rival Oregon State. In that game, Fernando Mendoza was absolutely on fire. completing 75% of his passes for 364 yards and 2 touchdowns. So he was a good quarterback for them this year. Got them out to a 3-0 start, but then they went right back to reality and lost 4 games in a row.
Yeah, when you look at those 4 games that they lost, they were by 1 point to Miami, 2 points to Pitt, 1 point to North Carolina State. So they were in some really close games, and people were giving teams that beat Cal a lot of credit. So, gosh, if they just got a bounce one way or the other that helped them, they could have had a very different season than where it finished.
Yeah. I mean, their defense was pretty solid. They were 36th in the country in total defense and scoring defense. Quarterback Noel Williams was their best player, and he finished 7th in the country in picks and 5th in passes defended. So he was kind of their rock on the defensive side of the ball. Offensively, like I mentioned, they had a good quarterback, but they really suffered on their offensive line. That's why they struggled on offense. If you look a little bit deeper in the numbers, they finished 128th in the country in sack rate. They gave up way too many sacks. They were 115th in the country in pass blocking, and they were 118th in the country in line yards per rush. So what that means is they weren't protecting their quarterback, and they were not protecting their running backs when they were running the ball at all. And that's just a recipe for a tough sledding, even if you do have a good quarterback in there. So, when I look at giving a grade to Cal, I mean, the expectations aren't super high at Cal. They went 5-7. I gave them a C, though I was really tempted to go lower because they do have the distinction of being the only FBS school in the country to lose to Florida State this year. And just for that, I should have knocked them down even more, but I didn't. So my grade for them was a C.
Gosh, that makes me want to make my grade lower. I also gave them a C. Just a crap season, man. What else is there to really say about it? They won 5 games, so for their record grade, they get a C for that.
And in 2024, the Cal Bears Nitro season grade is a C.
C's get degrees.
Okay. Up next, we have the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, who in 2024 went 4-8 after they went 4-8 in 2023. Let's talk a little bit about Wake Forest. They finished 15th in the new 17-team ACC, and that was enough to lead Dave Clawson to hang it up. He'd been a pretty good coach for them in recent years, had some impressive offenses led by some strong quarterbacks, the likes of Jamie Newman and Sam Hartman. But this year, they just really struggled. Hank Backmeyer was their quarterback, and he didn't live up anywhere close to those names. And they did have a 1,000-yard running back, but their offense was just not what it's been in recent years. And they really, really struggled on defense. They gave up 32 points a game this year. It was an interesting season because their very first game of the year was against UConn, who ended up being a really good football team this year. And they beat them. But then after that, they were just overmatched. The rest of the season, their O-line was really bad. They gave up 37 sacks. And they just made mistakes in close games. They close losses to Cal, North Carolina, Duke. They all had a shot to win, but they just didn't. So, just a bad year.
Yeah, bad year. And this is a team that was a few years ago in the ACC championship game.
That's right.
Yeah. So, seeing them come back down to earth, they're a team that always benefits from having an exceptional quarterback. Like you're saying with Jamie Newman that one year, Sam Hartman, and we've seen it in the past. But just another bad year following last year. So I don't really have anything positive to say other than they played football.
Yeah, it was their second straight losing season. And before that, they'd been to a bowl game 7 years in a row. So as you mentioned, they had been pretty solid, and this was another not good year, and it led to the retirement of their coach. With that being said, I gave them a D-. I thought this was a pretty bad year for Wake Forest. The offense was bad, the defense was bad, and they forced the retirement of their coach.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I also gave them a D-. I mean, if you play so bad that your coach retires from the game, like that's not even rage quitting.
Yeah.
That's beyond it. So that's pretty bad. So yeah, I'm a D-. As far as their record goes, they won 4 games, so they get a C- for that. And for the Nitro Show 2024 final grade for the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, they get a solid D.
All right. Up next, we have the Stanford Cardinal. And yes, they are the Cardinal and not the Cardinals. In 2024, they went 3-9. In 2023, they had gone 3-9. So Troy Taylor in 2 years, he's put up 3-9 records in both years. Not unsuspected that they went 3-9 this year. They weren't expected to be a very good football team. Joining the ACC, another one of those California teams now in the ACC that had to fly across the country to play away games. It just surprises me how far this program has fallen off. This was a program that, had some history, was bad for a while. Jim Harbaugh got them on the right track. They had these great players, Toby Gerhart, Andrew Luck, Christian McCaffrey, Richard Sherman, really solid running defense, hard-nosed teams for so good for so many years. And they've just fallen back into what they were, in the late 90s and early 2000s, and just kind of a doormat team.
Yeah, there is literally no more remnant of the Jim Harbaugh era at Stanford. Everything you said, they used to be a very hard-nosed, pound-it kind of team, and they were going to punch you in the mouth. Now, they just don't have it.
Yeah. I would say they only won 3 games, but 2 of those games were actually upsets of really good football teams. They beat Syracuse on a 51-yard field goal, and then they also beat Louisville in a game that was highlighted by wide receiver Emmett Mosley, who caught 13 passes for 168 yards and 3 touchdowns. So they managed to pull off 2 big victories over really solid teams, but their quarterback, who I think is actually supposed to be really good, he transferred out. His name's Ashton Daniels. He was successful this season. He set their school quarterback rushing record with 669 yards, but once again, he transferred out. And their defense was still just porous. It didn't get any better from the year before. They did force 17 turnovers, and they had 3 that were returned for touchdowns. That was the school record. But other than that, not a lot to write home about. If there is one glimmer of hope, Andrew Luck has returned to the program. He is taking over as their GM, which college teams have new GMs now, which is strange. But he's going to have a tall task. Obviously, his dad has lots of experience in front offices, and we shall see if his quarterback brain transfers over to his team management brain, helping turn them back around. Stanford coming into the conference this year, I don't think they had lots of expectations. The fact that they pulled off 2 upset wins over solid teams, it's actually pretty good. I don't think they expected to win that many games this year. So 3-9 would be horrendous for most everybody else, but for them, a team that wasn't expected to be very good, I gave them a C.
Yeah, that is bad. It just is. When I think of Stanford, I still think about those old Jim Harbaugh teams, and it's disappointing to see where they're at now. So this season was just terrible. So I gave them a D. And as far as their record goes, since they only won 3 games, that gets them a D+ there.
And in 2024, the Nitro Show final grade for the Stanford Cardinal is a D.
Okay. Now let's talk about the worst team in college football.
Last but certainly least, the Florida State Seminoles. My God. Burl, tell me what happened with these fools.
I mean, I feel bad for Florida State fans. Truly.
I feel horrible.
Truly. I mean, you go from undefeated, getting snubbed out of the playoffs, then your entire roster sits out in a bowl game, and you get absolutely embarrassed by Georgia in the bowl game. And you have these high expectations coming into this season. You're Florida State, man. You get talent all over the place. You're in the state of Florida. You got talent just falling out of everywhere. And you just stink this year. I mean, just absolutely horrible. Wasn't there like a stretch where they were the only team in college football that hadn't scored more than 13 or 21 points, something like that, something crazy?
Probably.
I mean, what a fall.
This is the worst year-over-year collapse I have ever seen in college football.
And they didn't even get the death penalty.
Yeah. From undefeated and winning a conference championship to getting to making that 63-3 loss to Georgia in the bowl game not a fluke. Like, you could say, oh, players set out, and so they got destroyed by Georgia, who was really good and motivated, and they were going to be back. But then they played this whole season like the team that got shellacked by Georgia. Mike Norvell, this was his 5th year at Florida State, and after last year, he got a huge contract extension because he was a potential candidate to take the Alabama job. Florida State's now stuck with him. Like, they couldn't fire him, even though this season was so bad.
I know. He's so lucky that he got that big extension. I mean, this next year is make or break. I mean, maybe he gets another year after that. I don't know.
I think he's got a huge buyout. Like, I don't think he's going anywhere anytime soon. I think his buyout got upped a whole bunch when there was rumors that he might be up for the Alabama job. So
close.
I don't think he's going anywhere. And the problem is that coming into the 2024 season, they had lost a bunch of players to the NFL. So while they had some good young players, they used the transfer portal and brought in a bunch of guys. A lot of people called it like the best transfer portal class in the country. And it did not work at all. They had DJU coming in to play quarterback. That was a total disaster. He kept getting benched and then brought back and then benched and brought back all season long.
I like to call him the killer of coaches.
Seriously, he was. Like, just so bad. And it started off bad. They lost to Georgia Tech in Ireland on national TV, and everybody, was a top 10 team, and everybody saw that they were not that good of a team, and they were just absolutely putrid. There's no other way to describe it. They only scored more than 21 points once all season long, and that was against FCS Charleston Southern. Their only win outside of the Charleston Southern game was against Cal. And we say it's bad, but let me read these stats to you, and you will understand how bad this football team was. These are their stats in 2024. Now, keep in mind, there are 134 teams in FBS. Total offense, 132nd. Scoring offense, 131st. Total defense, 86th. Scoring defense, 87th. Turnover margin, 132nd. Sacks allowed, 132nd. Interceptions, 125th. Only 4 interceptions on the season. Third down conversion rate, 131st in the country. And third down defense, 111th in the country. That is god-awful in every single conceivable way. There are no stats that you can make to say that this team was a good football team at all. They were just horrible. Purdue may have only won 1 game this year, but it's my belief that if Purdue and Florida State played, Purdue would have won. to me, Florida State was the worst football team in the country this year. And that includes the non-Power 5 teams. Like, I think every team in the country would have beaten Florida State this year pretty much, other than, for some reason, Cal.
Which was close. It was a close game.
Yeah.
I'm going to say Cal was jet lagged because they had to fly back and forth across the country several times. Oh man, what a terrible season. My heart goes out to Florida State fans. You know, we kind of share a common bond in our hatred of Florida. So, and of course, being in the state of Georgia, growing up a Braves fan, you got the Chop and Dion playing for the Falcons and the Braves. So we've always had this kind of, you know, connection with Florida State, and Mark Richt came from Florida State. Throw that in there. I just feel bad for him. And I hope, I really, really hope that next year they bounce back. I hate to see a team go through this, a fan base go through this, unless it's Florida or Tennessee, you know, that's fine. But I hate to see a team like Florida State go through this. It's just painful to watch. And I don't want people to lose their jobs. So hopefully Norvell can get it figured out, and, you know, they'll be just good enough to lose to Georgia.
Yeah. With all that being said, typically when I do these grades and when we talk about teams, typically F is an F. Like when you're a kid in school, you know, you have A+, A-, but when you get to F, it's just an F. There's no such thing as an F+ or an F-, but this Florida State team was so bad. I give Florida State in 2024 an F-. That's how bad they were.
Indeed. I did too. I went with an F-. I wish I could go lower. I mean, it's just terrible. They did win 2 games somehow, and that got them a D+ for their record score.
I don't know why.
It's just the way it shook out. So the Nitro Show final grade for the 2024 Florida State Seminoles season is a big fat F.
Thank God the season's over. Fix it, Florida State.
Yeah, we want to see some good games against your other Florida teams that you play. We missed those.
All right. Well, that will wrap it up for the ACC. Once again, we want to thank you for joining us on the show tonight. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, hit that like button, and don't forget our contest. Please leave a comment on this video to enter the contest, and we will pick out some winners and let you know next week. Until then,
if you've made it this far and haven't subscribed, I don't know what you're doing.
So until next time, this is Streit.
I'm Burl.
And we'll see you next time. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs.